Today we are going to be discussing some major changes that took place after World War II. Specifically, I'd like you to focus on how did the United States help to rebuild post-war Europe and Japan, and how and why did the Cold War begin? The Allied leaders were faced with the task of deciding what to do with Germany after the conclusion of World War II. The United States and Great Britain feared the spread of communism and Soviet control in Eastern Europe. But they still had to compromise with the Soviet Union, which had fought with their alliance throughout the war. After much debate, the Allies finally agreed to the following provisions. Germany would be partitioned or divided into 4 separate zones. Each zone would be controlled by one of the major Allied powers. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern part of the country, while the United States, Great Britain, and France would hold parts in the western part of the country. Another important piece of the Allies' agreement was about what to do with the German capital of Berlin. They decided that this city was so important and so powerful when it comes to the country of Germany that they also would partition that into 4 separate zones as well. So we've got the Soviets controlling eastern Berlin, with the United States, Great Britain, and France taking small portions of the western part of the city. Also following World War II, the United Nations was developed. It's an international peacekeeping organization that was to replace the League of Nations that had been developed after World War I. The Allied powers hoped that the UN would be more powerful and more successful than the League of Nations had previously been. The 50 nations that initially joined hoped that it would settle international disputes and prevent any future wars. The United Nations still exists today, with its headquarters being located in New York City. Here is the logo of the United Nations, and also a view from inside the headquarters where member nations meet to discuss and negotiate any sort of international disputes that may arise. Let's take a quick look at a brain pop about what the United Nations does, what the goals are, and what the purpose of the UN is.
Hey, give me that. So now you're not going to talk to me? Well, I guess I'll answer this one alone. Dear Tim and Moby, what is the United Nations? What does it do? From Lorelei. The United Nations, or UN for short, is an organization that brings together the nations of the world to encourage peace, development, justice, human rights, and the well-being of all people. Well, the UN was started right after World War II. It replaced an organization called the League of Nations. The League of Nations had been established after World War I as part of the Treaty of Versailles. It was supposed to keep the peace and prevent future wars. Right, it didn't do the job and World War II happened. And then the League of Nations fell apart since it hadn't been effective. Well, the League had good ideals, but it didn't have any military power to carry out the decisions it made. So, after World War II, when the Allies had successfully defeated the Axis powers, the Charter, or set of rules, of the United Nations was drawn up. This time around, member nations had to agree that they would provide military forces to enforce the UN's peacekeeping decisions. On June 26, 1945, representatives from 50 countries signed the new charter and founded the UN. Today, there are 193 member countries of the United Nations. Countries don't automatically get to be members of the UN. They have to submit an application and be voted in by various administrative bodies. First, 9 out of 15 members of the UN Security Council have to vote in favor of admitting the country. Then, it has to be voted in by the General Assembly. If a two-thirds majority agrees to admit the country, it becomes a member of the UN. The General Assembly operates kind of like a worldwide Congress. It convenes in sessions every year from September to December to figure out ways to keep world peace and support developing countries. The UN can help developing countries in a lot of ways, whether by building roads, conducting democratic elections, digging wells, or providing vaccines to children. Oh, they meet at their main headquarters in New York City. It's sort of like an embassy inside, though. Even though it's on U.S. soil, the land occupied by the UN is international territory. There are other UN meeting places too, like the Peace Palace in the Netherlands, where all major UN court decisions are made. Well, the UN doesn't have a president. It has a Secretary General. There have been many Secretaries General over the years. They get elected for 5-year terms. The current one is Ban Ki-moon from South Korea. The Secretary General really runs the UN on a day-to-day basis. He gives the UN's official response to whatever's going on in the world that requires its attention. And when member nations disagree, he mediates disputes and makes sure the ideals of the United Nations are upheld and that its decisions are carried through. The United Nations can't force a country to comply with its decisions, but they do have major clout in the world and can use various tactics to get countries to do what they say. It's kind of like when your parents tell you to rake the leaves in the yard. They can't make you, but it's really in your best interest to do it. Which reminds me, you feel like some yard work, Moby?
Distrust soon arose between the West and the Soviets. Stalin set up communist governments and kept Soviet forces throughout all of Eastern Europe. Europe eventually split into two armed camps. It was democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. So we've got the Democrats in the West and communists in the East. The divide became so apparent that Winston Churchill, remember the leader of Great Britain, described in a very famous speech that an iron curtain had descended upon Europe. He thought that this divide was permanent and that the East and the West would be hard to ever reunite. The Western nations of Europe decided to practice a policy of containment, where they attempt to block the growth and influence of an ideology, in this case communism, by creating an alliance and providing support for countries in areas of conflict or unrest. So they hoped to stop the spread of communism by creating an alliance and providing support for any countries that needed it, weaker countries that were defending themselves against communism. President Truman provided a very obvious example of this in 1947 when he asked Congress for money to help Greece and Turkey fight off communism. That was known as the Truman Doctrine. The policy of containment went even further when the Marshall Plan was developed. It's also known as the European Recovery Program. The Marshall Plan provided massive financial aid to European countries to help rebuild their economies and to prevent the spread of communism. This chart displays the amount of funds that had been received in millions of dollars under the Marshall Plan. So if you look closely, Austria, for example, received $488 million from the United States to help them to rebuild their economy so that they would not be weak and vulnerable to communists. We've got France received a lot of aid. Remember, most of World War II had been fought in France, or a good amount of World War II. The United Kingdom received a huge amount of aid from the U.S. They had always been a strong ally of ours. Let's take a look at a quick video explaining how the Marshall Plan worked and what the purpose of it was.
Hi, I'm Frank Kavaris for About.com, and I'm here to talk to you about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was named after Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been a great general under Roosevelt and was the Secretary of State under Truman. In 1947 at Harvard, he made a famous speech announcing the beginnings of the planning of a great program to aid war-torn Europe. After the war, most European countries were devastated, and the only country in the world with the credit, the financing, and the industrial power to help was the United States. Indeed, at first, the Marshall Plan was offered not only to the countries of Europe, but to the Soviet Union, in the hopes, at least in the American hopes, that giving money might also provide a certain amount of influence. In the end, the Soviets understandably rejected the offer and rejected the implied control, but the program eventually funneled $13 billion into the countries of Europe, especially Western Europe. That money provided not only the makings of the post-war boom in Europe, but also, as it was intended to do, the preservation of democracy. There was some fear after the war that the Soviet model might be attractive to some countries of Europe. There were large communist parties in Italy, in France, and some other countries. In any event, the Marshall Plan, along with several other initiatives, shaped the course of Europe for the next 50 to 100 years. It not only brought prosperity back to Europe, but it was the beginnings of the organization of Europe into what eventually became the common market and the European.
As you can see, the Marshall Plan was in the best interest of the United States national security because they thought that rebuilding Europe's economy would prevent political and economic instability and create conditions that favored capitalism, the type of economy that we practice here in the United States. For example, after World War II, the United States troops occupied Japan. After occupation by American forces, Japan adopted a democratic form of government and eventually became a very strong ally of the United States. So this is just one example of the United States providing foreign aid, like under the Marshall Plan, and it being successful. That it helps the United States and it helps that other country as well. Be sure to turn into video number 2 to check out how all of these differences and the policy of containment actually leads to a crisis in Berlin.